How was Germany formed? During medieval times, the lands of Germany were scattered in hundreds of pieces and looked like this: counties, duchies, kingdoms, principalities, and free imperial cities all packed together in the strangest political structure of medieval Europe. This so-called empire changed its shape multiple times and took part in external and internal military conflicts. One of the entities, Prussia, grew in the next centuries through diplomacy, political unions, and wars. By the end of the 18th century, becoming one of the most powerful German kingdoms. During the Napoleonic Wars, what was left of the Holy Roman Empire was dismantled, and after the Peace of Vienna, Prussia expanded and became part of the new Confederation of German states. The next years represented revolutions across Europe. The idea of removing the old political structures and creating the new nation-states was envisioned. All across the German Confederation, many started to think about a single German nation. But not many wanted to give up power so fast. The German unification will happen through a series of wars carefully planned and executed by Prussia. Stick with us until the end. Despite the long-forgotten nature and complexity of the matter, let's try to understand what exactly caused the great powers of Denmark and Prussia to end up in back-to-back wars against one another. First, we need to try to understand the root of it all, the Schleswig-Holstein question. This was a diplomatic dispute between the powers of the Kingdom of Denmark and the contemporary German Confederation, relating to the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein. Over the years, the Duchy of Schleswig had long been a part of Denmark or under its crown in one way or another. Meanwhile, the Duchy of Holstein had been a part of the puzzle-pieced Holy Roman Empire for a good while. Nonetheless, beginning in 1460, both duchies were under the command of the same duke, who just so happens to be the King of Denmark, thanks to the Treaty of Reshaped. One particular chunk of this treaty would later haunt the Danes, though, and this was a line that implied, under German interpretation, that from that point on, the two duchies must remain forever undivided. This heavily controversial interpretation would start to become significant after the dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire and the formation of the German Confederation, which included the territory of Holstein. By this point, much of Holstein and Schleswig had become ethnically German. So when King Frederick VII of Denmark announced to the people of Schleswig that the duchy was to become even more closely tied to his kingdom, many of its citizens rebelled. Numerous of these people, who were ethnic Germans, wanted to see both duchies push further away from Denmark and closer to the German Confederation instead. The political systems within the Kingdom of Denmark and the Schleswig and Holstein duchies appeared to differ notably, and many Danes were concerned by Holstein's membership in the German Confederation and its potential interference in Danish affairs. Additionally, there were growing ethnic and linguistic divides throughout the duchies, which were only accentuated by the growing nationalism on both sides. As tensions and dissatisfaction grew, the newfound Schleswig-Holstein question eventually led to the first round of full-blown military conflict. The first straw appears to have been when King Frederick in 1848 was asked to recognize the joint Schleswig-Holstein state that had been described in the earlier treaty, and he ultimately declined to do so. His reasoning was that even though he recognized the right of Holstein to exist within the German Confederation, he far from wanted to see the same thing happen to Schleswig, which prompted him to state that he simply lacks the power, the right, or the wish to see Schleswig unite with Holstein as a German state. This was not taken well nor lightly by those who had made the request. A rebellion then followed, as the defiant citizens of Schleswig and Holstein were able to win over support from the troops of the Rendsburg fortress after marching there with their own growing militia. While some Danish troops at the fortress refused to join the cause, they made a deal to return to Denmark and refrain from joining the counteroffensive, although there was not much of a way for the Schleswig-Holstein rebels to really enforce this. Regardless, the rebels marched next to the city of Flensborg, which they swiftly occupied. While this success came early, it was short-lived, and the Schleswig-Holsteiners were soon chased out by the responding Danish troops who came out victorious at the Battle of Bov less than 2 weeks after the initial occupation. Still, the Germans were unwilling to see their friends fail, and Prussian troops were quickly sent in to support the rebels. The Battle of Schleswig on April 23rd, a couple of weeks following the Battle of Bov, resulted in a Prussian triumph. A series of successes followed for the Germans, but the Danes eventually turned the tide by the Battle of Sundeved in May, and seemed to have regained the upper hand from that point on. Now, with defeat after defeat and complete opposition from the rest of Europe, the Germans were forced to consider negotiation. The Danes, contrarily, rejected the demands made by the opposing belligerent and broke off diplomacy before an agreement could be made. Eventually, with building pressure from the surrounding European powers, the Armistice of Malmö was signed between Russia and Denmark and almost entirely accommodated Denmark's demands alone. This treaty was then ratified at Frankfurt and put a temporary pause on the war. The following year, the London Conference was convened in hopes of resolving the root of the conflict, but negotiations broke down despite British, Russian, and German agreements on the core matters. Denmark proved difficult to agree with once again, and the war was renewed a few months later in the spring of 1849. After a series of battles and many Danish victories, another truce was signed, but still no answer to the looming question. Finally, in May of 1852, the London Protocol was signed and approved by surrounding European powers and declared that the duchies would remain independent, though still in personal union with the Crown of Denmark. While this technically should have answered the ultimate question, for the Germans it didn't. Still displeased with the connection of the duchies to the Danish kingdom, and now the attempted changes made to the succession of the thrones within the kingdom and duchies, the Germans in and outside of Schleswig and Holstein remained ready to fight once again. The interwar period was depressingly short-lived, thanks to the unilateral resolution of the root of the conflict. The diplomatic portion of the dispute had continued, and after the death of King Frederick VII in Denmark, his successor attempted to enact new policies in violation of the London Protocol and in direct opposition to German views on the matter. By February 1st, 1864, the Second Schleswig War broke out when united Prussian and Austrian troops entered the Schleswig Duchy in response to the enactment of the November Constitution of 1863. This conflict played out much like the previous one and due to the same unsolved question, but finally came to a close in October of 1864 with the signing of the Treaty of Vienna. This time, with the Austrian Empire, the Kingdom of Prussia, and the Kingdom of Denmark all being involved, the Schleswig-Holstein question was finally resolved, at least the best that it could be. Denmark was now forced to cede the Duchy of Schleswig, all but for one small section, the Duchy of Holstein and the Duchy of Lauenburg, to Prussia and Austria. A later treaty would be signed between the latter two, which would grant Schleswig and Lauenburg to Prussia, while Austria took Holstein. This would not be the end of the newfound question between Prussia and Austria, though, and would eventually lead to the Austro-Prussian War. But finally, the original Schleswig-Holstein question had been answered. As for the Danes living within the duchies, who had long been Danish nationals, a 6-year period was granted for those who wished to leave the duchies and return to Denmark, as opposed to staying within the boundaries of either Prussia or Austria. Their neighboring Germans within the duchies, of course, were contrarily satisfied with their current situation. So, to summarize, the Dano-Prussian War, or more accurately the Dano-Prussian conflict, was not one simple battle or series of battles. Instead, it was a range of diplomatic discord and full-blown back-to-back wars, all rooted in one thing, the Schleswig-Holstein question. The question in all its complexity seems to come down to the simple dispute over how both duchies, either united or divided, should be governed and by whom. While the friction remained mostly between the German Confederation and the Kingdom of Denmark, Great Britain, Russia, Sweden, and other neighboring empires and kingdoms were dragged in throughout the conflict due to its effect on the surrounding European community. Still, from what we can understand, although Lord Palmerston believes that none of us could quite understand the whole thing, the big question truly involved only the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein, and the Kingdom of Denmark in opposition to the German Confederation. Everything and everyone else that was involved at one point or another appears to be collateral damage, which is to be expected considering the decades of diplomatic conflict turned military warfare in multiple bouts. In the end, the Germans seemed to have triumphed over their Danish adversaries, but ultimately, the Dano-Prussian conflict was not nearly so simple, and if we should believe Palmerston, there remains no one left to tell the tale in its entirety. As the second half of the 19th century came around, the clash for dominance and consolidated power over the region would be between the mighty Austrian Empire and the rising state of Prussia. Prussia, at the time, was part of the German Confederation and was becoming the most powerful and influential of the incorporated states next to the Austrian Empire. Its leaders were the Hohenzollern family, and in particular, King Wilhelm I, alongside Prime Minister Otto von Bismarck. On the other end, over the border in Austria, Emperor Franz Joseph I of the Habsburgs dynasty held the throne, although these rulers were developing a little bit of a rivalry between themselves, with both sides hoping to claim control over Central Europe and of the German-speaking nations. They did have a brief moment of cooperation during the Second Schleswig War. Prussia and Austria decided to invade the Danish-controlled land of Schleswig-Holstein together, and were successful in co-occupying the territory after the end of the war. A new crisis erupted in 1866, though, after Prussia took umbrage at political decisions made by the Austrian governor of Holstein. This sparked disputes between both sides and eventually led to Austria sending in precautionary troops along the Prussian border. In response, the Prussians partially mobilized 5 of their divisions at the end of March. Both parties now began preparing for war with each other, and Otto von Bismarck of Prussia had the idea to reach out to a more southern ally. On April 8th, Italy agreed that if Prussia went to war against Austria in the next 90 days, it would join the German state in an attempt to push back against Austria's power. This deal would secure the soon-to-come declaration of war from Bismarck and his allies. Austria was aware of this newfound friendship, though, and began mobilizing its own troops along the Italian border on April 21st. Italy then called for a general mobilization 5 days later, and Austria did the same thing on the following day. Now, it was Prussia's turn. Although its general mobilization occurred in a step-by-step process between the 3rd and the 12th of May, as all 3 sides were becoming more and more ready for battle, multiple German states began to form alliances with Austria. In hopes of counteracting this, Prussia invaded Hanover, Hesse, and Saxony on June 15th before they could put any real support behind Austria. 5 days later, just as they had promised, Italy declared war on Austria and came to Prussia's aid. On June 27th, Prussia faced their first loss at the Battle of Langensalza against Hanover, although their victory for the latter was short-lived, as the rest of Prussia's troops eventually surrounded them and forced them to surrender. The Austrian commander, Ludwig Benedict, was hesitant to take his own troops into direct conflict and showed major signs of indecisiveness, even as his Prussian counterparts moved with meticulous and extreme confidence. The Austrians, despite outnumbering the Prussians, were becoming surrounded and pushed back as their enemies fought with intelligent aggression. By the start of July, Benedict had given up hope and ordered a withdrawal of his men. He sent a plea to Emperor Franz Joseph, begging him to make peace with the Prussians to avoid what he predicted would be a catastrophe for the Austrian army. Much to Benedict's dismay, the emperor flat out refused. Now, the main portion of the war was about to take place. On the 3rd of July, the Prussian army of the Elbe and the Prussian First Army were ready to attack the Austrian army at the Battle of Königgrätz. While the Austrians numbered around 215,000, the Prussians only added up to about 124,000. Nonetheless, it was the Prussians who proved most offensive, as mist cleared from the air and the night's rainfall came to an end. The Austrian army opened fire on the Prussian right flank, which was under the command of Herwart von Bittenfeld. For what seemed to be the first time, the Prussians were now hesitant. Bittenfeld was unsure of whether a full attack would be wise at this point, eventually ordered Brigadier General von Schuyler to fall back into a defensive position with 7 battalions of the advance guard. Meanwhile, General Edward Frederick Charles von Franzicki led the Prussian 7th Division into the Sweep Forest and eventually ran into 2 Austrian corps. Somehow, the 7th Division proved successful in clearing the forest, and King Wilhelm ordered the First Army to join General Franzicki as he led his men into Sadova, which was shortly captured. Still, as the Prussian 8th and 4th Divisions tried to cross the Bistrica River and join their fellow troops, they were stopped in their tracks by heavy Austrian artillery fire. Oddly though, Benedict opted not to order a cavalry charge at the same time, which allowed the Prussians to maintain some level of resistance. The Austrians still had significantly better weaponry for long range, and of course, still outnumbered their adversaries. And a lucky advantage for the Prussians, though, the Austrians had not been prepared for the kind of close combat that they found themselves in against the 7th Division back in the forest. This is where the tide began to turn in favor of the Prussians. As the Austrians with their muzzle-loading small arms clashed with the Prussians and their breech-loading needle guns, the situation began to support the latter, who were able to operate their weaponry while on the move and didn't have to stay standing while reloading. Although the Prussians were temporarily pushed back, the Austrians made yet another mistake when Benedict refused to launch a full-blown counterattack against both Prussian armies. Instead, the Prussians fought back harder than ever and managed to wipe out Austria's battalion under Colonel Karl von Pock as the Prussian Second Army entered the battle, led by none other than the Crown Prince himself. The Austrian 2nd and 4th Corps continued to fight as best as they could, but the Prussians were more unified than ever before, and the Austrian defense was crumbling. As the final fragments of the prince's nearly 100,000-strong Second Army arrived and clashed with the Austrians, the latter began to realize their fate. They were taking mass casualties, and eventually Benedict himself decided to inform the emperor of the catastrophe that was occurring, just as he had warned earlier. The battle was over, and the Prussians had come out on top. As the Austrians retreated, some of the Prussian forces chased them towards Vienna and clashed with them along the way. These smaller skirmishes continued until July 22nd, ending only when an armistice was finally reached. The Peace of Prague was then signed on August 23rd and officially ended the Austro-Prussian War. Luckily for the Austrians, this treaty was actually very fair to the empire. Otto von Bismarck was a strategic man and had decided that the best option for Prussia would be to maintain a strong Austrian empire and essentially create an ally for themselves against the rest of Europe, whom Bismarck did not trust. Initially, King Wilhelm starkly disagreed with his prime minister and refused to do away with any harsh terms against Austria. It wasn't until Bismarck threatened not only to resign, but even to jump out of the fourth-story Nikolsburg castle window and agreed to give some favor to their adversary. No new territory was taken from Austria itself at the request of Bismarck, but the Austrians were forced to give up Schleswig-Holstein, Hanover, and some parts of Hesse and Bavaria to the Prussians. Nonetheless, the end of the war and the signing of this treaty confirmed Prussia's newfound authority throughout the region and Confederation, and soon the German states would become united under Emperor Wilhelm I without Austria. Before that, though, the Treaty of Vienna had been signed on October 3, 1866, after the Third War of Italian Independence, which had occurred throughout the Austro-Prussian War after Italy came to Prussia's defense. This treaty confirmed an earlier armistice between the nations and forced the Austrians to hand over Venetia to the Italians and a large chunk of Friuli to the French, who would then transfer power to the Italians as well. These were significant losses for the Austrian Empire, of course, but they were still mild in comparison to what Prussia and Italy as its ally could have demanded if not for the insistence of Bismarck, which would later come in handy at the outbreak of World War I. While the events leading up to the Austro-Prussian War had almost seemed to symbolize a new, stronger relationship between Prussia and Austria, this outcome would never come to fruition. The war, instead, drew a wedge between Austria and Prussia, and even between the latter and some of the southern German states. Though many mistakes made by Austrian military leadership and some luck on the part of the Prussians, the struggle would prove the dominance of Prussia in Central Europe and within the German Confederation. Not only that, but Prussia's victory only strengthened its authority and influence, which would continue to grow for decades to come. And although the resulting dissolution of the German Confederation and division between Austria and Prussia would end any hope of a united Germany that incorporated Austria, the Germans would not quit trying for many years to come. In the late 1800s, the struggle for the upper hand and overarching power throughout the European continent became a direct battle between the Second French Empire and the North German Confederation. The latter, which was de facto led by the Kingdom of Prussia, was beginning to threaten the current superiority of the French Empire with its recent victory in the Austro-Prussian War of 1866. Whether Otto von Bismarck, the Chancellor of Prussia, intended to rope France's Napoleon III into a war or not is still questioned by some historians. But either way, a war did come. Europe in the 19th century was a continent of change and power changes. The Germans, in particular, were immensely focused on the goal of uniting the entirety of the German states under the Prussian leader Otto von Bismarck. Following the Austro-Prussian War and the annexation of multiple German states that chose to oppose Prussia during the conflict, the North German Confederation was formed, prompting a very quick decline in opinion from the French. Napoleon III and his administration feared that the unification and continued strengthening of the German states would tip the scales and leave France as a weaker power and influence throughout the region. However, Napoleon did seem to already be overestimating his own authority. In response to the building menace of the new German Confederation, the French Emperor reached out to Chancellor Otto von Bismarck and made a hefty demand, insisting that the French borders of 1814 be restored by the Prussians. The demand was swiftly shot down by Bismarck, who had absolutely no interest in giving up any of his own belongings or authority in any kind of stretch to appease the French. The Chancellor did, however, take this opportunity to inform the southern German states, such as Württemberg, Baden, and Hesse-Darmstadt of Napoleon's plea as to strengthen his own relationship with his fellow Germans and solidify a defensive military alliance between them all. This is also the point at which Otto von Bismarck may have decided that provoking a conflict with the French would be a good thing for his confederation, and more importantly, for his future endeavors to unify all of the German states. The idea was that a war against France, particularly with France as the aggressor, would stir up enough German nationalism that ultimate unification of the remaining German states outside of the Confederation could be achieved. Bismarck also knew that a war with the French was inevitable at one point or another, and he was fully aware of the fact that his best chance at pulling in the southern states as allies was the first to declare war. The demand from Napoleon concerning the borders was unintentionally a great gift for Bismarck, as this played perfectly into his plan of pinning the French as the aggressors. The strategy was actually quite smart for the Prussian side. They knew that when this impending clash occurred, if the French could be undeniably blamed, every German state would come together to fight off their attacker. At the same time, Bismarck knew that France would have no allies against his German Union. As he stated himself, France, the victor, would be a danger to everybody, Prussia to nobody. The situation became even easier for the Prussians to manipulate when Leopold of Hohenzollern-Sigmaringen became a candidate for the Spanish throne. Leopold was a Prussian prince, and this greatly worried the French, who now feared a possible two-fronted alliance between the Germans and Spain. Napoleon put immense pressure on Spain to withdraw Leopold's candidacy, and their goal was eventually achieved. Nonetheless, Otto von Bismarck seems to have been unrelenting with his push for war. When France necessitated that the Prussian leadership refrained from ever supporting a Hohenzollern candidacy in Spain at any point in the future, the King of Prussia, William I, strongly rejected the demand. Bismarck was predictably also against this idea, and decided to release an altered summary of the Ems dispatch, which flatly refused the demand of the French. This, and the mistranslated context of the message, greatly escalated tension between France and Prussia even further. The French foreign minister, Agenor, Duc de Gramont, went as far as to say that the telegram left him feeling as though he had received a slap. Napoleon and his court were now forced to seriously consider the prospect of declaring war. The emperor's wife, Empress Eugenie, was strongly in favor of a war with Prussia, one which she believed would easily be won by the French Empire and would help to resolve both domestic and other political challenges. Foreign Minister Gramont was also a firm supporter of war with the Germans, especially after the Ems dispatch. This led to the final nail in what Napoleon thought would be Prussia's coffin, as his Prime Minister, Émile Ollivier, came to the conclusion that France had already exhausted all options to avoid a potential war, and that military conflict was the only choice that they would have left. The French people were in agreement as well, and a crowd of around 20,000 citizens even gathered in Paris, waving flags and patriotic banners through the streets of the capital, demanding that the war be declared on the offensive Prussians. Finally, on July 15, 1870, French mobilization began. Word quickly reached Prussia, and the German Confederation responded with mobilization that same night. Bavaria and Baden followed suit the next day, and on the 17th, Württemberg joined the movement. A declaration of war was not officially sent out by the French government until the 19th, but when it arrived, It was quickly met by a promise of an alliance to the German Confederation by the southern German states. If this was what the Prussians wanted, then they had officially achieved their goal. The war was about to begin. The initial plan of the French was laid out by Marshal Ney, who had since passed away, but it decided that the ideal approach was for France to take an offensive position, starting from Thionville and extending into the Prussian Rhineland. While this plan was at first agreed upon, it was eventually thrown out and replaced by a more defensive stance. The updated plan was formulated by General Charles Froussard and General Barthélemy Lubras, and took a very different approach than the Ney plan, by instead putting the army of the Rhine in a defensive position to simply protect the French-German border. Napoleon himself left Paris to take command of the army of the Rhine. The French were also expecting both Austria and the collective South German states to join the fight on their behalf. But of course, as for the Germans, this was simply not an option. The Austrians did consider coming to the aid of the French, eyeing the chance to avenge their previous humiliating defeat at the hands of the Prussians, but ultimately opted not to get involved without the additional alliance of Bavaria, Württemberg, and Baden. This left the French to face the German states on their own, just as Otto von Bismarck had predicted. Despite having no foreign support, Napoleon was determined to launch the opening attack. The hope was to catch the Germans off guard by beating them to the punch, and the first reasonable target appeared to be the town of Saarbrücken. General Froussard's Second Corps had determined that the only resistance guarding this border town was the Prussian 16th Infantry Division, which could be overpowered by a French incursion. The 2nd and 3rd Corps were subsequently led to the Saar River on July 31st with the goal of capturing Saarbrücken. The French troops crossed the border into Saarbrücken on August 2nd and quickly gained momentum against the 40th Regiment of the Prussian 16th Infantry Division. The Germans did fight back valiantly, inflicting more casualties than their counterpart in fact, but nonetheless, the French were able to begin driving them out of the town through a series of skirmishes. While this appeared to be a positive start to the war, Napoleon was not as confident as his troops on the battlefield may have been. News had reached the Emperor of the Germans successfully mobilizing the Prussian First Army, Prussian Second Army, and Prussian Third Army as two French corps were occupying Saarbrücken. France may have gained a short-lived upper hand, but the tide was quick to turn. The Prussians had now better mobilized their forces, whilst the French were on the offensive, but fairly unorganized and poorly mobilized. Napoleon became aware of this situation and decided to withdraw his troops from Saarbrücken before the Prussian armies could arrive. The French shifted back into a defensive position, and the Germans went on the offensive. Multiple battles would then take place throughout Wissembourg, Spijkeren, Wörth, Mars-la-Tour, Gravelotte, Metz, and Sedan. The latter proved to be the most significant clash thus far, and resulted in the capture of Napoleon III himself on September 1st, leaving the French without an emperor. France was now shaken both on the battlefield and back at home. Without an emperor, the Second French Empire completely collapsed. The rest of the authority in Napoleon's court was ousted, and a provisional government then declared the formation of the Third Republic on September 4th. The government changed its name to the Government of National Defense and had no plans of abandoning the war that the fallen empire had begun. Otto von Bismarck, contrarily, attempted to make peace with the new republic, but no reliable French authority could even be reached. The Prussians reacted by marching straight to Paris and launching a grueling siege that would last a draining 130 days. The Parisians were suffering immensely, and the new government was beginning to recognize the odds stacked heavily against them. The people of Paris were starving, and the French troops were being worn down day after day, leaving the new republic to no alternative than peace on German terms. As the French government was in disarray following the humiliating capture of the French Emperor Napoleon III, and after the French army suffered loss after loss on the front line, ending with the siege of its capital by an enemy they considered somewhat inferior, the situation was critical. Seeing their triumph all but certain in this situation, after long wars against powerful enemies like Denmark, Austria, and now France, and with the idea of a united Germany, all the puzzle pieces were in place. The German states realized the Union should be created around Prussia. On January 18th, Wilhelm was proclaimed German Emperor in the halls of mirrors at the Palace of Versailles in Paris. For the first time, the great majority of German speakers were unified under a nation-state, with the important exceptions of Austria and parts of Switzerland. Jules-Claude Gabriel Favre, the French foreign minister by this time, went to Versailles on January 24th to finally open negotiations with the Prussians. Bismarck no longer had reason to maintain the war, and subsequently agreed to a simple deal. The siege would be lifted and food delivered to Paris immediately, so long as the French gave up a handful of key fortresses outside of the capital that would render the city undefendable. Against strong opposition, Favre, who took the position of president on the 25th after President Trochu resigned, signs the armistice and surrendered to the Prussians on the 27th. On his carriage ride back to Paris, Favre's exhaustion and shame from the recent events overwhelmed him, and he broke down in tears, falling into his daughter's arms as the silence gifted by no more gunshots rang out at midnight for the first time in many days. There was a short-lived challenge to Favre's agreement with the Prussians, as one French statesman in particular, Léon Gambetta, initially refused to capitulate. Multiple French politicians, including Jules Simon, arrived in Bordeaux shortly after and were able to convince Gambetta to resign and hand over control of his troops to the government after only a few days. The war was now over. The unification of the German states had been completed just as Bismarck had hoped, and France was no longer Europe's strongman. Peace had come, as had the fall of the French Empire and French superiority across the continent.